impact sessions, etc. Then you got your diversion programs, which are so important. That's where your youth programs are coming into place, to where you're getting ahead and teaching those youth how to deal with human service, how to deal with public service, how to deal with the navigation of their own systems. And lastly, you'll see that last box, which refers to reshaping systems. What am I talking about there? I'm talking about systemic systems that have caused so much degradation in these communities. The inability for employment to happen, the inability for people within these communities to be able to feed themselves because there's no stores. I can go on and on and on. You're not going to get communal change, and you don't get societal change in readjusting some of these processes that causes those needs to be so great. Now, those 6 areas, now you get into your community-based organization and your people. They don't come in to tell you what they're going to do. You should be designing the system in terms of how they're going to operate. You let them bring their expertise into the process, but then you give them a system which they need to operate from and define how they're going to do what they do. Your community-based organizations should be trying to make sure that that structure, that out front in the moment and that recovery structure is always at the forefront. So we're talking about looking at root causes. We're talking about really creating the long-term change that needs to happen. This slide is extremely important. This is a structure that we have put in place in cities across the nation: Newark, Seattle, Milwaukee. I can go on and on and on. So this is not a haphazard thinking, practical application. Let's move. I can. Okay. Happening with my next slide. I'm gonna show you a 2-minute video to kind of give you an idea of where this work is at now, okay? I'm Dr. Basheer, founder of the Professional Community Intervention Training Institute, which is a partner in the Collaborative Public Safety Collective. The problem that the collective is attempting to solve is the vicious violence that is perpetuated in our communities. That violence stems from systematic racism, inequality, and a variety of other things. What's so unique about the collaborative is we have brought some of the best experts, the traumatized people who have to deal with violence, and the public safety professionals, which includes law enforcement, to try to attack this and create the strategies and skill sets that are going to allow us to be effective in really combating the culture of violence as well as violence itself. From a societal standpoint, I think we truly need to embrace the fact that we are at an inflection point because of what has transpired with George Floyd and numerous other situations in the community. We cannot look for law enforcement to be the only anchor and the only individuals and organizations that deal with public safety. We have got to make sure that we fund and invest in other strategies like the community-based public safety collective, who can bring additional solutions to the table and help us truly deal with the issues of concern in our community while embracing and broadening the concept of public safety where it's inclusive of all. Just a quick snippet there. And please, Brandon, jump in at any time. These slides are going to take me about another 10 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time to move the process. But I really want to paint, as I so said, paint the actual picture of what is actually transpiring. So once we build that whole framework out, we have got to concentrate on what is our actual targeted population. It's one thing to say people who are violent, but no, that is not enough. We've got to deal with the individuals. We got to deal with the behaviors. We've got to deal with the areas, and we've got to deal with the needs. And this has to be done collaboratively as we move and try to get the individuals to change the narrative, stop the actions, etc. So we've got to be clear what our process is. Let me say this, and I think it's extremely important. We have been too individually driven in this area of work. We have done so much of the work based on relationships, based on the ability of knowing the people who are doing the violence, because so many of us come out of the culture, etc. We have had to flip this whole continuum from a people-driven perspective to a system-driven perspective. If you're going to really create the change in Pasadena, you've got to build those inherent systems that drive the process and not the individuals. You'll have individuals that will come in and serve in a leadership role at times, but the system will design or decide what that is, who that is, and what that looks like. Then we got to actually, so what are we actually dealing with? We talked about our targeted population on the last slide. Now, look at what this slide actually says. We're really actually dealing with three components here. We're dealing with the actual engagement with actual weaponry, which is guns. We're dealing with the actual group violence. And then we actually dealing with the gang violence. We call this the 3 Gs. This is actually the 4 Gs because there's another G that's not on this slide, which is the ghost violence, not ghost guns, but ghost violence. That's the inherent violence that comes from nowhere, that is unexpected, that we had to engage in. And with these 4 areas, you have got to have the Pacific Protocol and strategies on how to engage these areas. You're starting to see that this is a science. This is not some haphazard emotional engagement. People that do this work and are effective at this work are operating from systems, are operating with structure, are operating with protocol, and have a blueprint and a game plan on where they're going and how they're going to get there. We're talking about community-based public safety. So what does that actually look like? If we're going to be effective, components of what you see on the board basis the regular public safety system, most public safety, and especially law enforcement driven public safety, is usually to apprehend, to interrogate, and to arrest. They have never been and should never be the social scientists in our community. Whereas if you look at the left side of this screen, you'll see what true community-based public safety is. And that is the nature of this work, community-based public safety. You'll see all the different components of that are part of that. And then now you can understand why it's so effective, because it's able to meet so many more needs than just the regular professional public safety system. This gets back to the question of some people will ask, well, do we work with law enforcement? Do we do A, B, and C? What you work with is the public safety system. Anybody within that system that is trying to get to the same goal, you look for what you can do and you look for what you can't do. And you establish those boundaries up front with any type of engagement. In this work, we don't pass intel to law enforcement. We're not on their payroll, but we have the same eventual goal if they're true to the process, which is making that community safe. So we will see if there's any type of alignment. As we said earlier, we're talking about complementary strategies of public safety. But community-based public safety means a community leadership is taking a role, we're putting the public back into public safety, and we're creating systems that we know how to deal with our own traumatized community while working with all the components of the professional public safety system. Okay, so real quickly, the interventionists are the interdictionists. If I was to sum it up in one word, they're troubleshooting specialists. They know how to go into a situation. We know how to go in. We know how to analyze. We know how to frame. We know how to manage. We know how to get to solutions. These are the things that we are attempting to do when we engage in these violent engagements. At the end of the day, we just don't want to temporarily stabilize the engagement. We want to ultimately get to the root cause and stop it, and stop the retaliatorial comeback of that engagement. So we utilize a whole process to do that. I talked about license to operate earlier, so I'm not going to go deep there, but I do want you to look at this paragraph. Violence intervention. Community violence intervention is a resident-driven, victim-centered, impact people-led strategy. That's what it is. Okay, we're coming into a situation, we're bringing the lived experience, we're bringing the expertise to our training process, we're developing our protocol, and we are saying that we can handle the needs in our community, whether it be gang violence, whether it be domestic violence, whether it be interpersonal violence, because we're coming in with frameworks and not identifying the individual situations, but coming in with processes that get us to end results, coming in with templates that work regardless of what that situation looks like. Okay, so what are some of the components of this actual system? There's not just the violence interrupters that are important to the system. You also have community navigators. These are trained community members who do not deal with the hardcore violence, but they work with multiple disciplines almost as oil. They're able to work with human services. They're able to work with public safety. Again, what did I say earlier? Putting the public back into public safety, giving ownership and giving voice to community members and getting them trained professionally to where they know how to navigate and they can take some ownership at the end of the day. Look, team, the key to all of this work is if we don't move the process where community ownership is driving the process, if we as the so-called specialists, experts, as some people call themselves, et cetera, if we have to drive that whole system, we're doing that community a serious disservice. Then we talk about the community sentinels. This is the youth leadership programs that have to be in place. Those of us that are aged in this work, we have got to make sure succession is on board. We should be teaching these young sisters and these young brothers how to step in, take our role, remove us from the process so the system can continue to flow. In most communities of color, we don't do that because, again, our leadership is personally or individually driven. Then we talk about the community health worker, another specialist. This is a responder that usually deals with the wellness or the wellness circles or the wellness hubs. Let's move forward. Then we get our outreach worker. Big difference between an outreach worker and a violence intervention specialist. Okay, the outreach worker is able to touch people. Some outreach workers are violence intervention workers. Some violence intervention specialists do outreach, but there is an actual separation of those two terms. And some of your effective violence intervention systems will have both of these individuals on board. Then you get your violence interrupter that most of you are familiar with, but you can see it's only one part of a multi-level system. Then you got to have your high-risk interventionist or your high-risk incident specialist who 24/7 is on all of the incidents. They're not doing all the work of the violence intervention specialists, but they're specifically specialized responders that have specialized expertise on top of the violence intervention specialists, and they're able to go in as spot fire specialists and put out fires immediately, spot on, etc. A different degree of expertise. Most violence interrupters do evolve to the point of high-risk responders, but there is definitely a dividing line there. Okay, now once you got your people, you got your targeted population, you know what you're trying to do with your system, you know what people you're trying to look at, now you got to be able to place your people. Where are your people going to fit in terms of the overall system, in terms of what that looks like? This is where we utilize a process called the three-prong process. If you look at the top of that thing, prong one, these are the individuals that could stop the blood flow at all means. They're the ones that could stop the carnage in the street. My prong two people are my support team. They're the ones, once we stop the blood flow, they can come in and stabilize what we have stopped. What happens in most communities when you don't have a process like the three-prong process, you'll get your people on the ground that can stop the blood flow in the moment. But what do we see time and time again? We see retaliatory engagement a month, 2 months, and 6 months down the line. That's because once we stopped and temporarily stabilized the individuals, we didn't anchor them. So when the triggers transpired again, they went back to the same process that they used before because they had no options and they had nothing to work with outside of what they had to work with when they were using the violence. So if you look at